Camp in Yorkshire is a remarkable World War II museum. However, it once was a prisoner of war camp for Italian and German soldiers during the Second World War. We know lots about how the Nazis treated prisoners of war, and also how the Japanese did. However, what was life like on the other side of the coin for those Axis prisoners of war? Were they treated well, or were they treated poorly? Well, today we're going to look at life inside a prisoner of war camp for German soldiers in Britain.
Hey guys, what's going on? JitteryJay here. Hope everybody's having a great day so far. Today I'm checking out something a little different. This one was a recent request by someone named Oddball Kane, who said that people kept ignoring him when he would request things. Well, I'm not most people, so we're going to jump straight into this and check it out. I told you I got you. If you guys request it, I write it down so I don't forget. It may take reminding me a couple of times, but I got everything written down. Anyway, this is how were German treated? Pause. Take a breath. How were Germans treated in British POW camps? This was during the Second World War, I'm assuming. No, let's put that up there. Okay, I got it right. Anyway, I was hoping that was going to work. Anyway, I finally learned how to use the lower thirds of the screen. It's little things that I pick up along the way, but I'm old, so it takes me a while to get used to things. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. We're here to check this out, but first we're going to hit the Untold story, or the Untold Past, with a like and subscribe on the original video. That's the important part, to show support wherever we go. All of their links, as well as a link to the original video, will be in the description below, so you can go check that out. That being said, let's get into this and see just how were they treated in POW camps.
Eden Camp in Yorkshire is a remarkable World War II museum. However, it once was a prisoner of war camp for Italian and German soldiers during the Second World War. We know lots about how the Nazis treated prisoners of war, and also how the Japanese did. However, what was life like on the other side of the coin for those Axis prisoners of war?
That's a really good question. Before he gets started explaining anything, even when I was a kid, back in the 70s and 80s, we had two history classes to take. We had American history and we had world history. But even in world history, we always were taught about the atrocities that were committed by the Germans and the Japanese and the Soviets against the Allied troops. We were never taught about what the other side of the coin was, how we treated our prisoners of war, because we did have prisoners of war. Both sides did. Hundreds of thousands, if I remember correctly. But yeah, we never learned that. And then world histories, for some reason, got changed into social studies, and then it got changed into sociology. And then from there, who the hell knows, got changed into gender studies or something like that. I have no idea what it got changed into after that. I was done with school by then. But anyway, I find that kind of interesting that they never teach us the other side of that coin.
However, what was life like on the other side of the coin for those Axis prisoners of war? Were they treated well, or were they treated poorly?
Right.
Well, today we're going to look at life inside a prisoner of war camp for German soldiers in Britain. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
Make sure.
During the Second World War, large numbers of German prisoners were held in Britain, and even they were interred there after the war had finished. In their peak, many different camps saw around 400,000 prisoners, which began to fall after the conflict when repatriation began.
Like I said, hundreds of thousands of people on both sides were interred in camps and POW camps all over the fucking place.
100,000 prisoners, which began to fall after the conflict when repatriation began. The experiences of these soldiers differed greatly from those who were captive in Soviet camps. That doesn't mean, however, that the British were lenient with their responsibilities. However, the Germans were treated in a more humane way, and fewer prisoners died in British captivity than in other countries. The British government sought to introduce a programme of re-education which was aimed at demonstrating the evils of the Nazi regime to the prisoners and to promote a democracy over a dictatorship. Initially, at the start of the conflict, the only Germans captured by the British were naval personnel and members of the Luftwaffe who had crashed their aircraft in Britain. The first prisoners were
the Luftwaffe. Those were the fighter pilots, weren't they? If I remember right, the German fighter pilots, because they came off the boats. If I remember right.
Members of the Luftwaffe who had crashed their aircraft in Britain. The first prisoners were the captain and crew of submarine U-39 on the 14th of September 1939. The commanding officer of U-39, Captain Gerhard Glatz, would become one of the longest term prisoners in British hands, being finally released in 1947 after 7.5 years of captivity. Initially there were only 2 prisoner of war camps, Camp No. 1, Griesdale Hall in Cumbria, and Camp No. 2, Glen Mill in Oldham. Griesdale Hall was a 40-room mansion that was reserved for officers and had space for 200 prisoners of war, and Glen Mill was a former cotton mill that would house 2,000 other prisoners, with prisoners here being of the rank of sergeant or lower. There wasn't a need for many camps at the time, as Britain adopted the policy of sending all their enemy prisoners to Canada. One reason for this was to make it very difficult for prisoners of war to escape back to Germany.
That makes a lot of sense. Send them half a world away. Jesus. I didn't realize that they did that, though. I didn't realize they sent them to Canada. I knew that Canada was partly Britain controlled. If not all. No, I can't remember if Britain controls Canada or not. It's been so long since I was in school, it's not even funny. Not going to go there. But anyway, yeah, I never knew that they sent them over here.
The reason for this was to make it very difficult for prisoners of war to escape back to Germany. Another reason was that food and other necessities were being rationed already in Britain, and they didn't want supplies to be strained by German prisoners of war.
Well, that makes sense.
Men were shipped to Canada as soon as there was simply enough to fill a boat, and around 9,000 German prisoners were being held in Canada by late 1942. Following the campaigns in the desert, the situation changed, especially with Allied success in the North African campaigns. Alongside the US Army, the Allied success would lead to the Axis surrender in May 1943 in this area. This may have been a huge victory, however there was a new issue at hand. What would the Allies do with 260,000 new prisoners of war that they now had possession of?
Jesus. Just from that one skirmish? 260,000 new prisoners of war? Jesus Christ.
260,000 new prisoners of war that they now had possession of. About half of these POWs were German and the other half were Italian. It was agreed that any joint operation between Britain and the US would see prisoners shared 50-50, regardless of whichever nation captured the soldiers.
Okay.
At this time though, Britain's resources were extremely stretched, and the government asked the US to take 130,000 prisoners, as well as their own share. The US government would agree to this on the condition that they could use the POWs as a labour force in America. Britain's own prisoners from the desert would be held in camps in the Middle East, and only a few high-ranking officers were sent back to Britain. The Italian prisoners were also transported back to the UK, where they were held in a newly built network of camps. In fact, some of these POWs would actually build their own camps. They were then used in agriculture and mobilised as...
Sorry. That is messed up. They would actually build their own camps? It's free labor. I mean, if you look at it that way. But still, using them for the labor force makes sense because all of the able-bodied men were being drafted to go over there. So that makes sense too.
POWs would actually build their own camps. They were then used in agriculture and mobilised as a workforce. Numbers of POWs increased even more as the invasion of Normandy took place, and after D-Day, German troops would be rounded up and transported then back to Britain. Usually those prisoners whose surname began with a letter in the first half of the alphabet was sent to America, being transported eventually to the States via Liverpool, but as more ports fell into Allied hands, the US would then ship them directly back to America. Those prisoners with a surname beginning in the second half of the alphabet were transported to the UK, then taken to transit camps for interrogation, and then sent into a network of now several hundred camps built all around the nation.
Okay.
Many of these, as mentioned before, had been built by the Italians, but as many of these were being repatriated, the Germans would then go on to live in these camps that had been vacated. As the Allies gained more territory, they would begin to set up POW camps in foreign territory, for example in Belgium. These weren't the greatest in terms of their conditions and were extremely harsh. Chances are that the guards had been influenced in their treatment of the Germans by what they had seen in terms of combat against the Wehrmacht.
Yeah, I can understand some of that, but yeah, there were atrocities on both sides. Don't get it twisted. Granted, we only hear about one side of the coin, like he said, but there were atrocities on both sides.
Influenced in their treatment of the Germans by what they had seen in terms of combat against the Wehrmacht. These camps would be shut down with all prisoners being transferred to Britain by late July 1946. It was at this time where the largest number of German POWs arrived in Britain. But what were conditions inside the camp like? Well, if we compare them with camps in the Soviet Union and the east and southeast of Europe, then Germans imprisoned in Britain were incredibly lucky. The Soviet Union's camps saw a fatality rate of almost 35% for its over 3 million German POWs, with Britain seeing just a
3 million German POWs at 35%. That's Jesus. That's a million people, a million fatalities. But yet, they only gave Hitler shit for the millions that he killed. And the Soviets were just as bad.
percent for its over 3 million German POWs, with Britain seeing just a 0.03 fatality rate for its 3.6 million prisoners. German POWs in the UK were graded in terms of their feelings towards Hitler and the Nazis. This would then lead to different soldiers being sent to different camps based on their Nazi sentiment. Obviously, the more pro-Nazi camps would be much stricter. The grades are as followed. Grade A or white was considered anti-Nazi. Grade B was that they had less clear feelings or weren't as reliable as Grade A prisoners. Grade C or black was that they had Nazi feelings, and Grade C+, also black, meant that prisoners were deemed to be ardent Nazis. In terms of conditions, it was rather good for prisoners in Britain. Some camps were considered less strict than others across the nation, such as at Eden Camp. The prisoners had more modern conveniences than other camps, and their living quarters were better. The camps which dealt with more ardent Nazis would be much stricter, and would in fact place more stress on re-educating. In terms of work, even before the German surrender, some POWs were put to work as agricultural labourers, and after VE Day, all prisoners were required to work. Most POWs worked on farms, as Britain at the time needed a high level of food production, and there was a big shortage of agricultural workers.
Well, they had a shortage of food too, because if I remember right, the German U-boats were bombing the Allied ships that were trying to bring in food and supplies to Britain, if I remember right. And they ended up having a shortage of food and everything else. They had people dying from diseases and everything. But they don't teach us. They never taught us any of this in school. It's disturbing that they don't.
Most POWs worked on farms, as Britain at the time needed a high level of food production, and there was a big shortage of agricultural workers. In mid-1946, almost half of all POWs would be employed on farms. At first, the groups of usually 30 men would be escorted to work in the fields by armed guards, being kept under close supervision at all times. As time went on following the German surrender, the British allowed some prisoners to be even stationed on the farms where they were employed under minimal supervision. Many of these workers could then earn a wage directly from the farm for the first time since the start of the war, and prisoners would usually receive pay of 1 shilling a day. This was considered by the government as merely pocket money and could have been used following repatriation. In a few rare occasions, the British even put a very limited number of prisoners of war to work, disposing of unexploded bombs, landmines and ammunition. This was incredibly dangerous and in fact forbidden by the Geneva Convention.
Yeah, I thought that was forbidden. You kind of gotta use your own troops for that shit. Use your own specialists.
Ammunition. This was incredibly dangerous and in fact forbidden by the Geneva Convention, which Britain stated wasn't valid in the post-war period. At least 3 German prisoners of war are known to have died doing this role. During a nasty bout of snowstorms in the winter of 1946-47, German prisoners of war worked alongside Allied soldiers to help reopen roads and rail routes, providing important labour. Inside the camps they were allocated a certain amount of food, mostly bread and meat each day. These rations would be collected by British soldiers and then distributed by the POW's own cooks, who helped to prepare the food. Before admitting prisoners into the camps, the British would usually vet the prisoners to see if they could perform specific roles inside the camp, such as cooks, doctors or dentists, based on their pre-war life. There would be running water.
Well, that makes sense too. Use them for what their specialty is, you know. Assign them jobs based on what they're good at, and you get better quality work.
As cooks, doctors or dentists.
You get better morale too, because people are doing what they're used to doing before all the chaos started. You know what I mean?
Based on their pre-war life. There would be running water and showers and bathrooms for the soldiers, and also other amenities on site, such as a chapel and even in some camps a music hall. This was a space where prisoners could create their own shows and get some escapism from their incarceration. They were also encouraged to create their own camp magazines, and they received a weekly German language newspaper published by the British government called Wochenpost. Also, lectures would have been arranged at the camps, a library would be found, and they could obtain books, records and even films, which could be shown. All of these activities were meant to create a sense of freedom, freedom of speech and political tolerance. In fact, some prisoners were even allowed to attend a college which had been set up. Some sports teams were even set up by the inmates, and prisoners would arrange local football matches against local teams. The day-to-day organisation of the camp was from the sergeant or the orderly officers, but discipline of the soldiers was under the responsibility of their own NCOs and officers.
Well, that's interesting. Make them discipline discipline themselves. Is that their own officers and NCOs? In other words, treat them just like they're still in their military.
Discipline of the soldiers was under the responsibility of their own NCOs and officers. Many of the prisoners didn't really play up, as they considered their imprisonment as better than what they'd experienced when fighting, and there were very few incidents of prisoners being treated very poorly. Guards would usually carry truncheons rather than rifles, in case something did kick off though, but many prisoners accepted their positions and knew they were being looked after well. Random spot checks would occur at times to see if POWs were in possession of any banned items, and any prisoner who did misbehave would find themselves in a sin bin or jail for a term of solitary confinement. This must have been very tough, as the social aspect of the camp was a real positive for the prisoners.
Right.
Roll calls would take place twice a day to ensure no escapes, and prisoners lived in their billets. This living space housed a number of POWs, and they would have their own beds but also be allowed to use this space to relax, play different games and in some cases even paint. After their work was done, the prisoners' time was their own really, and they could do different things such as performing their own plays.
So basically it's just like a prison nowadays. Yeah. They give them what I think way back when I was locked up, it was an hour of outside time a day in an enclosed courtyard, and then we had like gym time was about an hour a day. Everything to get your exercise in so that you weren't just wasting away. And it kind of required you to go too.
Play different games and in some cases even paint. After their work was done, the prisoners' time was their own really, and they could do different things such as performing their own plays. Choirs would even form from talented musicians, and they even made their own musical instruments, and audiences made up of British officers, their wives and fellow prisoners would watch the shows. Particularly in German prisoner of war camps, mail was monitored to ensure that no information would seep through about the prisoners' family members being killed, for example in bombing raids. This was due to the prisoner then becoming rebellious, refusing to go to work and disobeying orders.
Trying to keep morale
If this
up.
did happen though, the commanding officer would sentence them to 7, 14 or even 21 days in solitary confinement, and possibly even put them on rations of bread and water. So overall, really, the conditions in the camps weren't too bad. Some Italian prisoners of war who were considered cooperative were even allowed out in the evenings to go for a walk around the local villages, but were not allowed to fraternise with the local people. However, naturally, this sometimes wasn't adhered to, and relationships and friendships would form between them.
You're not going to stop people from socializing. It's no matter how much you try to ban a certain group from socializing with another group, you're never going to stop it. It's human nature. We are very social creatures, and yeah, you're not going to even curb that desire, even if they're like Italians and British, or Germans and British, Germans and Italians, it doesn't matter. It's all about connection. So I get
around the local villages, but were not allowed to fraternise with the local people. However, naturally, this sometimes wasn't adhered to, and relationships and friendships would form between them and the local people. Some citizens, however, did feel some animosity towards German prisoners in particular. However, as time passed, their feelings did change and people began to sympathise with the prisoners. In late 1946, civilians were allowed to invite prisoners into their homes for Christmas, a practice that moved many prisoners, giving them a feeling of family that they missed so much back home. By late 1947, the restrictions were virtually lifted, and the men could leave the camp unescorted, visit cafes and cinemas, and attend local church services. There was initially a ban on romantic liaisons, but immediately after this was lifted, 796 marriages took place between German prisoners of war and British women, with many more following. The main
796 marriages as soon as it was lifted. See? That's what I was saying. It's all about connection. We are very social creatures. But 796? Wow.
between German prisoners of war and British women, with many more following. The main aim of the imprisonment was to provide re-education to the prisoners about the Nazis and about the political ideology that they'd been force-fed and brainwashed with prior to the war. It's said that the British made the biggest effort when it came.
I don't mean to keep pausing, but you got to remember that Hitler targeted the youth, so they started brainwashing them from a very, very young age to believe in his beliefs, to follow in his beliefs. So it would take a lot to get that out of their heads, so to speak. So I see why that would be their main focus. I mean, it's kind of preventive maintenance, so to speak. It's trying to curb the ideology that Hitler was promoting. But
Education to the prisoners about the Nazis and about the political ideology that they'd been force-fed and brainwashed with prior to the war. It's said that the British made the biggest effort when it came to re-educating prisoners, which in turn helped the Germans to return to a free and democratic country later on.
Right.
The prisoners considered themselves very lucky to be imprisoned in Britain, especially those who would later find themselves in West Germany following the conflict. Repatriating the German prisoners began in September 1946. The decision to do this was delayed due to Britain's need for a workforce to rebuild the country and work on the farms, because of the collapse of the German economy, and also because they had to repatriate Italian prisoners of war first, following them switching sides. Most of the men had been returned to Germany by the latter part of 1948. A significant number of POWs were reluctant to return to Germany, and Britain did introduce a scheme allowing them to stay on as civilian workers, and around 25,000 of these men were accepted. So in terms of conditions inside a prisoner of war camp in Britain, they were excellent compared with other camps in other nations. The most important thing was to re-educate, and the POWs on the whole were treated with respect and were allowed to socialise with each other. Although working on a farm would be difficult at times, the fact that the prisoners managed to get their own time in the evenings was key to their well-being and productivity. They were allowed a more significant degree of freedom than in other camps, and in a sense were a much-needed workforce for Britain. If a prisoner did find himself imprisoned in Britain though, they must have felt lucky, as they could have very easily ended up in a Soviet camp, which, believe me, was much more brutal. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Once again, thank you for watching.
Sorry, pointing the wrong way.
Eden Camp.
Stop. Don't do that. I was pointing the wrong way. I was pointing at the screen I'm looking at instead of the one that's up here. Anyway, this was a very interesting watch. Like I said, they didn't teach us none of this in school. They taught us about the wars and about the atrocities on the other side, about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They taught us, of course, about that. That's what got us into the war. They briefly covered the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I think that's the two. They briefly covered that, and I think it's because it's a bad look on us, you know, to create something that destructive. But anyway, like I said, this is a very interesting watch. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this in the comments, and I would love to know what else I need to check out, and I will get there as soon as I can. I said I write everything down so I don't forget. I know with my memory issues, it's very easy for me to forget things. So, like I said, every now and again, if I haven't gotten to your request yet, just remind me and throw me a comment and remind me, and I'll get to it as soon as I can. That being said, that is just about going to do it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this with me, and I hope to see you on the next one. I love you guys. Peace. Hey guys, make sure to check out one of my other videos right here at JitteryJay.